But Dr. Peterson, I mean, in a world full of what I would call the modern day serpents, if you will, that always tempt us with the proverbial apples, who do you believe are today's serpents in modern society, and what strategies can the masses employ to unite and resist and resist being fragmented by these few?
I think it's at a certain level of analysis, it's always the same old story. The medieval Christians did a pretty good job of laying out the landscape of sin. So, well, what tempts us? Well, pride for sure.
Sure.
We celebrate pride, as a matter of fact, right? We devote a substantial amount of time and resources to the celebration of pride.
For sure.
Everyone thinks that's kind of a, what would you say, that use of language is, well, not serious. That isn't really what it means. And I think, no, that's pretty much exactly what it means. Pride, we celebrate hedonism as well, especially on the sexual front, but with our celebration of materialism in general. And that's a bad idea, not least because if you worship hedonism and you celebrate pleasure, you destroy the source of pleasure itself. It doesn't work. So I'll give you an example of that. The people who have the most sex now are religious married people. Right, so that's a very comical end to the sexual revolution.
With all due respect, by the way, you mentioned in a recent interview you had with Michaela, your daughter, that the most important ingredient for a successful marriage these days is wild sex, wasn't it? That was sort of tongue-in-cheek, I guess, but you said it. Your words, my friend.
Yeah. Well, yeah, that was a good joke for Michaela, but it's also not a joke, and it also reflects something very fundamental, is that the sexual revolution promised constant orgastic satisfaction to everyone, who, no matter who they might be. And there's a story in Revelation, it's a very interesting story, an image. It's an image of the end of time. And it has two components. One component is the scarlet beast, and the scarlet beast is blood-colored, and it's patriarchal, it's male. It has multiple heads. And so what it represents is the masculine social world, the patriarchy, when it degenerates. Okay, so a society that's well-structured and a psyche that's well-structured should be a unity. Okay, when that unity falls apart, so when God dies, when that unity falls apart, you get something with many heads because it's confused. Okay, that's the degenerate patriarchal state. And it's blood-colored because that's the precursor to a further degeneration into the chaos that destroys everything. So that's the scarlet beast of the state. That's the degeneration of the masculine. Okay, on top of that, in this image, which is an image of the end of times, you have the whore of Babylon. Okay, in the biblical text, Babylon is the hedonistic tyranny. That's really what it stands for. And the whore of Babylon is a woman, a beautiful woman, attired in materialistic costuming in gold, holding a cup full of the liquids of her fornication. It's a very dramatic image.
Liquids of her fornication.
Yes, it's a very dramatic and horrifying image. But what she represents is if the masculine deteriorates, so does the feminine. And when the feminine deteriorates, it commodifies sexuality. That's the hallmark of the deteriorated feminine, the commodification of sexuality. You see that now with the incredibly widespread dispersion of pornography, about 30% of internet traffic, something like that. And of course, when the security that marriage, monogamous marriage, and an integrated male state, when that disappears, one of the tempting pathways for women is the commodification of sexuality. Okay, so that's an end time image. The feminine deteriorates in the masculine. There's a kicker, though. The beast kills the prostitute. So what that implies is that the degenerate masculine state offers hedonistic pleasure as an enticement to slavery, and then kills the source of pleasure itself. And that's exactly right. We see that because what's happening is that as the sexual revolution progressed and hedonism ruled, sex itself started to vanish. So 30% of Japanese young people under the age of 30 are virgins. right? And many people across the West.
What's the figure?
30%.
Is that right?
Yes. Yes, and
Holy moly.
it's not only Japan. You see the same pattern in South Korea. And they're only like 10 years ahead of the West in general on the developmental curve.
What would you attribute that to fundamentally?
I don't think that sex can sustain itself in the absence of a monogamous framework.
Yep.
Well, this is also what you see reflected in the fact that it's married religious couples who have the most sex. It's like we don't know. Sex is a complicated business. And it's as complicated as survival, right? Reproduction and survival, those are the two big challenges. And the idea that sex can be handled simply as a matter of mere momentary pleasure, there's no reason to assume that's true. Now, that was the promise of the sexual revolution, but it's now 60 years since the sexual revolution, and we can see that it's not delivering on its promises. Quite the contrary. It's destroying what it set out to free.
Doctor, if I may, I mean, I don't want to sound facetious here,
Yeah.
but there's this very old joke here in Brazil that basically marriage is where sex goes to die.
Yeah, well, the statistical...
Wouldn't that be a contradiction?
Yeah, but it's not true.
It's not true.
No, well, that's the thing, is that the empirical data show very clearly that that's not true.
Great.
That it is literally now that religious married couples are having the best sexual lives. And you know, it might even be under those conditions that sexual life is rarely optimal. But then you should ask yourself too, why should it be any less difficult to optimize your sexual life than it is to optimize anything else that you do? It's a very difficult thing to manage. Now you might say, well, it's even more difficult to manage in a monogamous relationship. It's like, I don't think there's any evidence whatsoever for that claim. Most dating people are not... Most people's solution to the dating problem is to find someone and quit dating. And the reason for that is because the dating life is not preferable to having the partner that you want.
Yep.
And you might say, well, there's still problems if you have the partner you want. It's like, well, you're probably the problem.
Let's see if I'm accurate here then, Doctor, because I believe so, considering what you said, that we perhaps have sunk into a depth where marriage, in a strange way, has become sort of countercultural or hip or sexy again, going against the grain, or going against the current prevailing winds.
Yes.
To get married has become sexy again, if
Yes,
you will.
yes. No, I think
Would you
that's
concur?
right.
Would you concur?
Yeah, and I think that's also the case for having children. I think
right.
what you'll see, look,
I'll get there.
The upper class never stopped being married.
Oh, yeah.
Right? So when we pulled the rug out from underneath the institution of monogamous, long-term monogamous, religious-centered partnering, what happened was marriage died from the bottom of the economic hierarchy upward. But it never died at the stratosphere. And that's because the virtue-signaling aristocrats are perfectly happy to talk and to promote like a hedonistic individualism, but when it comes to themselves and their own children, none of that goes.
Speaking of them, they're very much present here in Brazilian elite circles for sure. The virtue signaling aristocrats. I like that expression.
Yeah. Well, they see the thing about, that's the luxury belief idea. The thing about the aristocrats,
they're derided sometimes as Bollinger, Bolsheviks, limousine liberals, if you will.
Right.
That sort of
they can...
the caviar left.
Exactly. They can afford to have they can afford to promote the irresponsible hedonistic virtues because they don't pay a price for doing it. The people who pay a price are the people, the farther you go down on the socioeconomic ladder, the more people pay a price for the idiot hedonistic whims of the aristocrats. There's the old saying, when the upper class gets a cold, the lower class dies of pneumonia. And that's exactly right. So when you destabilize the social order, you don't free the serfs. You just abandon them to like an anarchic desert. And one of the things we will see happening, and I can see it already starting, is that committed monogamy with children will become fashionable again among the elite. That's already happening, and that'll spread down the hierarchy. Yeah,
right.
You can see that happening
Dr.
already.
Peterson, I believe it was Niccolo Machiavelli the Italian philosopher from the Renaissance, who said once that society needs to rediscover God periodically. And most recently, along in the same vein, we had a very astute comment coming from none other than Joe Rogan, who I believe is your friend at this point, who's a pragmatic guy. He's a humble guy.
Oh, yes.
He doesn't pretend to be someone who he isn't.
Yeah.
And he said, quote, like, if he came back now, it would be great, referring himself, of course, to Jesus. And he went on to say, sort of tongue-in-cheek, Jesus, if you're thinking about coming back, perhaps now is a good time.
Yeah,
now
right,
it's a good
right.
time. We're kind of fucked. Sorry for my French. Pardon my French. So do you believe such a time for such a discovery has come, and what would that entail?
So you're going to ask a simple question, are you? It's always the case, mythologically speaking, that the hero is born at the darkest moment. That's why we put Christmas around December 21st, right? When the sun disappears most intensely. And the birth of Christ is commensurate with the rebirth of the sun. The chaos of the darkness calls out the necessity of the hero, right? So in the ancient Egyptian creation story, the god of the state, Osiris, is overthrown by his evil brother, who cuts him into pieces and distributes him everywhere. Things fall apart. That's what that signifies. The goddess of chaos, Isis, makes her appearance and makes herself pregnant with the appropriate remains of Osiris. She gives birth to Horus. Horus is like King Arthur. Horus is like Simba in The Lion King. It's the same story. He grows up alienated from the state, like we all do. He's a falcon because he can see. And he can see evil. And so he goes back to Egypt and he has a terrible battle with his uncle and overthrows him. Whenever things are dire, that story repeats. Things degenerate into chaos. There's a fruitfulness about chaos. It gives rise to, it calls for the rebirth of the hero. And the hero makes himself manifest when things are darkest. And so, and often in the most unlikely places, hence the manger, for example. Or you see that in the story of Moses, because he's a threatened Hebrew slave who's sentenced to death on the water, right? So Rogan believes that the chaos is such that a rebirth is necessary, and that's true. It's true. He's got that right, and he's in a good place to detect that, because Rogan is a upward aiming and straight shooting sort of character, and he's also talked and listened to, 2,000 expert people. So he's very informed. And it's not just Rogan. You can see this in other culture edge people. Ayaan Hirsi Ali converted to Christianity. So did her husband, Neil Ferguson. They were both...
From the University of Austin, correct?
Yes. They were both admirers of the horsemen of the atheist movement. They moved away from that. Ayaan recently had a debate with Dawkins on that very topic. And she told me, I just interviewed her, she told me that the resurgence of Christian faith saved her from some very dark times. And so Russell Brand is another example.
Amazing.
Douglas Murray has made similar statements. So has David Rubin. Who else? By the way, that'll do for the time being. So you can see this shift occurring.
What a performance by Doug Murray against Mehdi Hassan, right? I saw you tweeted that.
Yeah. Well,
at the monk debates, correct?
You have to be a fool indeed to accept an invitation to debate Douglas Murray.
It's suicide, right?
God. I mean, maybe Ben Shapiro could manage it.
Oh, yeah.
But, and perhaps Russell Brand. But
I'd pay money to watch that, for sure.
Yeah, no kidding. No, so would I. I'd line up to watch that, for sure. Yeah. So, but then, Russell, for example, and Douglas would not be best suited for a debate. They would be best suited for a discussion, because they would listen to each other and they would get somewhere.
For sure.
No, I mean, I just talked to Douglas 2 days ago. I happened to be in Toronto when he was there for the monk debates just before I came here.
Yep.
they invited him back because he'd made such a hash out of
Probably Israel versus Palestine?
No, it was the previous monk debate. He was debating the man who wrote Blink. What's his name? A famous novelist. Can't remember his name at the moment, but
we'll search in.
Murray is very charismatic, and he's an unbelievably sharp-aimed debater. And so I guess I haven't watched it yet, but I know the outcome was that the vote of the audience, which is a very liberal audience, given that it's Canada, was radically in favor of Murray, as it was when he had engaged in the previous year's monk debate. So, good for him. Yeah. And Douglas is one of those people like Ayaan Hirsi Ali who have absolute spines of steel, right? They're really quite remarkable people.
They're definitely examples for us and very well regarded here in Brazil.
Well, and one of the things that's very compelling about their examples, and this is something for everyone to really understand, is that the conservative types will say to young people, it's your duty to tell the truth. You should tell the truth. They'll wag their fingers and moralize about it. But what the conservatives are good at conscience, but they're not very good at calling. And what they don't tell young people is that one of the reasons the primary reason, perhaps a primary reason that you should tell the truth is because it's an incredibly adventurous thing to do. And so when you look at the lives of Ayaan Hirsi Ali, for example, and Douglas Murray, they're traveling all over the world. They occupy a central place and well-deserved on the public stage. They're very much worth listening to.
Yep.
Their lives are anything but dull. The reason for that is because they're telling the truth. The truth is an adventure. And
and people evermore, they place a high premium and they reward whoever seems to be the truth teller in society.
Well, they might punish them to begin with. This is the cost, right?
But that's the cost. That's the cost.
But just because something has a price in the short term doesn't mean it's not a good long-term strategy. And the truth is, people lie to get things they don't deserve and to avoid consequences they do deserve. And lies work in the very short term, but the sacrifice that you engage in by lying is that you forego the adventure of your life. And so the promise in the Christian corpus is that the adventure that you would have by telling the truth is of sufficient depth to justify the suffering of life. And you kind of know this with your kids, because you want your kids to go out there and hit the target, right? To put everything they have behind it, to push the boulder uphill. And you have an intuition that they're at their best when they're doing that. That's what you want to celebrate when you see them on the sports field, for example, or in a competition in their class. You want to see them having that, thriving in that way and having that adventure. You have an intuition that if they only continued to do that properly, that they would have the lives they should have.
They would excel.
They'd excel, exactly, and that would be worth it. Well, so this is what happens in the story of Abraham. So Abraham, in some ways, he had a childhood like the one you described. He's the child of wealthy parents, and there's no evidence in the story that Abraham ever had to lift a finger. And God doesn't come to him till he's like 70. He's living in his father's tent. He has everything done for him. He has the socialist paradise at hand, right? He's a completely satiated infant. And God comes to him as the voice of adventure and says, you have to leave your zone of comfort and go out into the world. And it's quite a catastrophe because Abraham goes out in the world and the aristocrats conspire to steal his wife. He encounters starvation and tyranny. He ends up in a war, he ends up having to sacrifice his son. Like his life is a sequence of cataclysmic adventures. But he has enough faith and courage at the beginning to leave and to journey out in the world. And God makes him an offer. This is a very cool thing to understand because it speaks of a kind of alignment of instinct and destiny. So imagine that there's something in you that calls you to adventure. Okay, now the question would be, if you listened to that and made the necessary sacrifices to do that, and you did nothing else, right? You were religious in your observance of that, what would happen? Well, this is the offer that God makes Abraham. He says, 4 things will happen if you do this. You'll be a blessing to yourself. So that's a good deal, because many of us are often curses to ourselves because we're embarrassed about the way we conduct ourselves. So you'll be a blessing to yourself. That's a good deal. You'll be a blessing to yourself in a manner that will bring you renown that's deserved among your fellow men. So that's a good deal.
Of course. It stimulates you to keep moving forward.
Well, and it places you around friends and allies wherever you go.
Exactly.
And it's deserved.
Yeah.
So that's a good deal. That's a great deal. Okay, but that's not all. The third deal is that you'll do that in a way that will enable you to establish something of permanent value. So that's the dynasty in Abraham's case, because he's destined to become the father of nations. So he'll do something permanent, and this is the kicker, you'll do all of that in a way that's a blessing to everyone else. So then imagine, this is so cool. This is so cool if it's right. So imagine that there's an instinct to develop in children that you foster as a benevolent father. You encourage it. And then you could imagine that characterizes your child and they develop optimally. Okay, so what does that mean? Well, it means their spirits become integrated and line up. It means that integrated spirit is now looked upon with admiration by other people, and they're a target of emulation. That both of those things happen in a way that's most likely to establish something permanent and lasting, and all of that happens in a way that's of benefit to everyone else. That's a good deal. That's the covenant that God establishes with Abraham in the biblical story.
There you go.
And I can't see how that can possibly be wrong, because the alternative hypothesis is that the spirit of adventure that motivates children and adults to develop would make them a curse to themselves. No. Would decrease their value to others. No. Would make it impossible to establish something permanent. Well, that's foolish. Why would you have the instinct? And that would only take away from others. It's like, no, you know perfectly well, if you're on a sports team and you have the best player on your team who's also a good sport, then that player is a benefit to himself, and he's a gift to the team.
To the whole.
Right, yeah, absolutely, in a way that makes him and the team develop too.
For sure.
Right, exactly. So there's no zero sum.
I don't want to sound corny, but we always go back to there's no I in team, right?
Right.
There sort of is. I mean, the whole team is composed of different I's, I guess.
Right, but they're all, they're all playing a game.
Yep.
Right, well, that's the best. One of the things I came to understand in the last 2 years, took me a long time to figure this out, like 40 years, was that the spirit of play, so that would be what really unites a team. The spirit of play is the antithesis to tyranny. And so that team, the reason that there's no I isn't because the I's disappear. They don't. The I's are optimally integrated in the game. And you know this is true perfectly well. When a team is really functioning optimally together, when they're hot, everyone on the team is striving upward in a way that optimizes their own development. They're doing that in relationship to everyone else, and the whole team is getting better, right? And that's when it's fun. That's what's so cool. It's even fun to watch.
Oh yeah.
Right.
Don't take it from us. I mean, why don't we mention just recently the GOAT, Tom Brady? He said that without his teammates, he wouldn't have had not even close to the career that he was able to achieve.
Well,
so he's very grateful for that, and coming from him speaks volumes.
Yeah, you should listen to it. That's right. Well, there's also something very interesting about that as well, which is that the success of Brady didn't detract from the success of his teammates. Quite the contrary, right? The more successful he was, the better off all his teammates were.
There you go.
That's the hallmark of a properly functioning society, and it's the antithesis to that zero-sum game that the apocalypse-mongering utopians are trying to foist on everyone, right? It's like, well, there's not enough to go around, and everyone's going to have to be restricted, and you're going to have to get used to having less. It's like, no, there's plenty to go around. If people function together properly, there would be, that's also a biblical promise. There's more than enough to go around if everyone aims upward, and I think that's right.